All right. Well, good morning. Happy Wednesday, April 29th. We are back with our community circle conversation group this morning. So happy that you're here. We did change up a few of the settings. So when you're coming in, your video and you should already be off and your microphone should be muted. When you go into the breakout rooms, we'll want to make sure as you enter there, you can turn your video on and you should be able to have control over that at that time. So again, though, we do have our chat box. So if you have questions, please feel free to enter something into the chat box there. And then we'll go ahead and Bridget, if you could take us to the next slide, we'll get started. Okay. So in our time together today, this is a reminder, I'm going to look and see if our friend Dustin has joined us, Dustin Miller. If you're here yet, you
I'm
can go
on.
ahead. Oh, you're on. Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
you don't need to
Good.
switch my video on. I'll be brief so that you can
Okay.
get
All right.
on the road, give these folks enough time. Uh,
Uh,
the
oh,
second half of today, what I'm going to cover is all the other programs that were provided in the CARES Act. You've seen a lot out there related to the PPP, the economic disaster loan, maybe unemployment. I'm going to cover out of that bill that was $2 trillion, multiple other programs that have been of interest to people. So it'll be a pretty information intensive
okay.
just about the different programs. And certainly I hope people either, I encourage you to go to your breakout rooms and then watch me later, hopefully. Any potential programs of interest to you, to certainly reach out to United Way and schedule a time for us to talk about any particular programs.
Okay, great. So thanks for that. And then we will have our main presentation here starting shortly on financial scenario planning. I did want to go ahead and launch a poll. Oh, I have the privileges to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll real quick as people are coming in. And this is going to help Courtney kind of tailor her presentation. So which best describes your organization's status? Are you currently operating with limited or reduced service, or temporarily shut down? So I'll leave this up for a minute as people come in and get started, and then that will really help Courtney on the fly tailor a few of her comments so that she's best speaking to our audience. So I'm going to give it another, there's a countdown, or it's a count up. Just kidding. We have 61 people who voted out of 73. So if you haven't gotten your response in yet, take a minute. Let us know where your organization stands right now. It's looking like the majority are currently operating. We have about a quarter of the group that's limited, reduced service, and then a small percentage, here it says about 6% for organizations or for respondents, we might have folks from the same organization, are temporarily shut down. So it looks like we have 89% of you have voted. So if this is your first poll, you'll just choose one of those responses, and I'm going to go ahead and end this here in about 10 seconds. So do your best. If you don't know, it's okay. You don't have to respond, but this will give us a good sense, I think, of where organizations are. Okay, so right now it looks like about 70% are currently operating, quarter at that reduced service, and then about 5 or 6% at the temporarily shut down. So I think I shared those results with you all. I can show that to you. So that will help us kind of think through our conversation later in a few minutes. So thank you for your responses. So then we'll move into deeper discussions after our financial scenario planning. As Dustin mentioned, he's going to be presenting in the main room on the Legislative CARE Act, and that session will be recorded. So if you have been noticing, we'll be sending out our recaps as we do, and then we also have been uploading both the main presentation and the legislative sessions recaps on our COVID-19 page on our website. So you should be able to catch that after this morning. I did also want to call out, and at the end we'll share some resources. Giving Tuesday now, there's a community-wide, it's actually a worldwide, I think, day of giving on May 5th. Giving Tuesday is normally around Thanksgiving, but they're doing kind of a COVID response day on May 5th coming up, which is, I cannot believe it, next week, next Tuesday. And so we've pulled together some resources that I'll share at the end. I just wanted to preview when we come back together. We'll just take a couple minutes, and I'm actually going to leave the meeting open a few extra minutes longer this week, so that you can, in the chat box, share some more of what you want to see for our community circle conversations, because we will be meeting tomorrow, the funding group that you see here, the partners, to really look through what is the next phase of these conversations going to look like. So let's continue on. And Dustin already gave us his preview, so we can keep going. All right, let's see. Let's bring up Eric and Courtney. If you could start your video and unmute yourselves, and we'll get an intro into what we're going to talk about today.
Thanks a lot, Brianne. Welcome everybody to the community conversations. So, as we were discussing what would be helpful to everybody in this time, it struck us that one of the things that we're all working on or concerned about right now are those knotty issues like cash flow and revenue, and whether or not we have really screwed up our annual budget at this time, either because we've had, as an organization, had a reduction in revenue or an unexpected increase in expenses. And so how do we as an organization deal with that going forward? Do we start to model different scenarios that we can then really pull a budget off the shelf that happens to be consistent with the scenario? So I asked Courtney De Ronde, who is a CPA and a planner, to come talk to us about some of the things that we can do at this point in time to ensure that our organizations come out the other end of this crisis as healthy as possible. And as I think we all talked about in the last recession, really ready to put our foot on the gas as we round that corner into recovery, and be able to serve the clients, and to be responsive to the needs in the community. So I'll turn it over to Courtney, and she can go ahead and talk to you about some of the things that we can do at this point in time. So thanks and welcome, Courtney.
All right, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Brianne. Good morning, everyone. I've been serving small businesses and nonprofits for about 18 years now. And also, as a CPA and partner within my firm, I'm also a small business owner. So I totally get the challenges that we're all facing as a result of this uncertain time. I'm so glad to hear that about 70% of you are still operating. That's really helpful to know kind of where everybody falls, because I saw a quote last week about, we're not all in the same boat, we're all in the same storm. And that is so true. We all are in different places, but it's good to know that, a good majority of you are still operating. And even though you're still operating, I know, from our experience, we're still operating as well. That doesn't mean everything is going as you had originally planned. And so I'm excited to be here with you this morning to talk about some steps you can take to plan your way forward. So as I mentioned, I'm a CPA leading an accounting firm. So the way my brain works is to think about the financial side of the crisis. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty and change happening around us. And sometimes this volatility can make us feel like we just want to kind of hold tight and react and see what happens. But times of crisis and economic uncertainty can actually create opportunities for us to accelerate changes that we needed or wanted to do anyway. A few weeks ago, I was reminded of the Stockdale paradox. Jim Collins writes about this in his book, Good to Great. So Admiral James Stockdale was a Vietnam prisoner of war for several years. Over the course of his imprisonment, he was tortured numerous times, and he spent years in solitary confinement. But he survived. And so when Collins interviewed him years later for his book, he asked him how it was that he had survived. And Stockdale said, "I never doubted not only that we would get out, but that I would prevail in the end." So you can see the quote there on the screen. He had this belief that he would prevail in the end, but he confronted the brutal facts of his current reality. So a lot of times we can endure something if we know when it will end, or if we have some control over the situation. So Stockdale, he didn't have any sense of if he would get out or when he would be tortured again. He didn't have a lot of control. So Collins, in his interview of Stockdale, asks him, who didn't make it out? And he said, "Oh, that's easy. It was the optimists. The people who were optimistic would think we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and go. And then we're going to be out by Easter. Easter would come and go. We're going to be out by Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving would come and go, and we didn't get out, and then all of a sudden it's Christmas again." Stockdale said, "Those optimists died of a broken heart." So this quote is such a good reminder that the reason he survived was because he never wavered on his faith that he would prevail, but he didn't lose sight of the brutal facts of his current reality. That's the paradox. This kind of two different, seemingly, adversarial positions that I believe I will prevail, but these are my brutal facts. And so that's something that we have to balance during this time as well. We have to be sure that we will prevail, but we can't just sit back and wait to see what happens or be overly optimistic that things will change without any action by us. So we have to be aware of our current situation and the brutal facts that we face, and then take action. There's a lot of pressure on us as leaders to do something. It's challenging to know, what do we do and when do we do it? And I'm sure, like me, throughout this unprecedented time, you've made decisions about things that you weren't even thinking about a few weeks prior. So first, we need to stabilize. Understand the brutal facts of your current reality, then respond in a rapid but measured approach. We want to resist the urge to return to some illusion of normalcy. Instead, take this as an opportunity to accelerate changes that you wanted or needed to make anyway, and then thrive in your new reality. So this morning, we're going to talk about 2 financial forecasting tools you can use to stabilize and then thrive in your new reality. Take advantage of some changes that you wanted or needed to make anyway during this time. So we're going to talk about projecting your cash flow and analyzing program profitability. These 2 concepts are applicable anytime, whether we're in a crisis or an economic downturn or a high, but it usually takes some kind of crisis before we place priority on them. So when it comes to projecting your cash flow, we have to understand our current reality. So remember the Stockdale paradox. We don't want to lose faith that we're going to get through this, but we can't ignore the facts of our current reality. And for some of us, those facts are brutal. Maybe we don't have a lot of reserves to rely on, or maybe there are lots of changes even though we're operating. For some of you who are operating at a reduced rate or temporarily shut down, that is challenging. And so your facts may be very brutal. Cash flow is a common problem for organizations, even in good times. So in this economic uncertainty, it can be even more pronounced. You might have events that have been canceled. You might have clients that you serve that aren't able to pay their bills, or funding sources that aren't able to maintain their payment timing. You'll still need to continue to pay your employees. How are you going to pay your suppliers? So understanding your current state is really about making sure you know how much cash you have available. You want to consolidate as many liquid resources as possible. And for some of you as nonprofit organizations, you have different sources of cash: short-term investments, long-term investments, restrictions on funds that have been placed on by donors. You might have designations that have been put on by your board. So it can be, an exercise in and of itself just to evaluate, what do I currently have available to me? So determine that first. Then you're going to project your cash flow and determine what changes you need to make. So cash flow is all about where your cash is coming from and where it's going. You might earn revenue, but not collect payment from your customer or your granting agency right away. A lot of grants are reimbursement based. So you're performing services and providing assistance and submitting for reimbursement, and you don't get your money until later. You might have donors who promise to give, make pledges, and you collect on those later. You may incur a cost but not have to pay your vendor until later. Sometimes you have to prepay for things that you haven't received. You might collect advance payments from your customers or your grantors. You may, sell tickets to events in advance, and you have this cash, but you still have an obligation down the road. So each of these are examples of how your profitability, your change in net assets, could be different than the timing of your cash flow. Purchases and sales of property and equipment and investments, as well as borrowings and repayments on debt, those are also differences between your profit and your cash. So all of those items are reported in a cash flow statement as cash flows from operations, investing, or financing activities. So that cash flow statement, that's probably part of at least your annual reporting package, it's one of the basic financial statements, that reports what's already happened in the past. It can be helpful for analysis, but it's really what's already happened. At this point, you need to determine where you're headed and what changes you need to make. And that is a cash flow projection. So what you can see on your screen now is an example of a cash flow projection. When your organization is steady and things are fairly predictable, this is something you should do on a monthly basis. That's generally sufficient. But you can see this example is weekly. In times of uncertainty or volatility, projecting your cash flow on a weekly basis is probably necessary. So what you're going to want to do is create and maintain a weekly spreadsheet. So this is not a once and done thing. You're going to create it and then you're going to maintain it every week. So looking at the example there on the screen, your cash flow projection starts in that upper left-hand corner below week 1, where it says the first line, cash on hand at the beginning of the week. What you would do is have this spreadsheet, and if you need a copy of something like this, I'm glad to send you, an Excel version if you don't have something to start with. But you're going to start out with your cash you have on hand today. So that's first where you're understanding your current state. What are all the liquid resources I have available in my organization? You're going to enter that in the upper left-hand corner, week 1, cash on hand, beginning of the week. So if you start this today, you're going to put, what is the cash on hand I have available to me today? Then in that same week 1 column, you're going to enter your expected cash receipts. week by week. So starting with week 1, what do I expect to receive in cash? You know, there's various sources listed there as examples. It could be maybe you have cash sales, maybe you collect receivables, or maybe it's from customers, maybe it's from granting agencies. Perhaps you have some interest income, loan proceeds, you receive contributions. Maybe there are transfers from your endowment fund available to you. You might have other sources as well that you could add in there. But what you're going to do is enter the expected cash receipts. You're going to have to base this on budgets and estimates. But it's important to remember that if you sell something this week, or if you perform services this week and you don't get reimbursed until later, those proceeds shouldn't show up in your projection this week. They actually would show up 3 weeks from now under collections on accounts receivable, if that's when you collect it. So the same concept applies to contributions receivable. You're entering in your projection the timing of when you expect to receive the cash. So that, for a lot of organizations, is different than the timing of when they earn the revenue and record it in their income statement as revenue. This is all based on your anticipated timing. So you can see in this example, for collections of AR, I show, every 3 to 4 weeks, a big chunk of collections. So that could be your scenario. Maybe you only do invoicing once a month, and your grantors or customers pay within, it tends to be, let's say, 15 days or 30 days or 45 days. So maybe your cash collections come in relatively consistently in big chunks because you invoice in big chunks. Now, if you're invoicing every week, maybe you have cash coming in every week. So you have to put in the projections and estimates based on your actual, your estimated operations for your specific organization. The next section below that is the anticipated, we can go back to that slide, that anticipated cash flow. So the bottom section of the spreadsheet, this is where you're entering your expected cash disbursements for each week. So again, you're going to have to base this on budgets or estimates. These are things like your salaries, employee benefits, costs of occupancy, costs of production if you're producing anything, training, marketing, legal and accounting, and credit card bills. Could also be if you have loan payments to make, or if you have capital purchases that you're going to be making. So again, focus on your estimated timing of when you would pay these items. In this example, for salaries, I'm showing a biweekly payroll. So if you incur payroll costs all throughout the pay period, but you only pay it every other week, it's going to show up in your projection every other week. If you were doing a monthly projection, you would be less, detailed about the timing of it, because over the course of the month, I'm putting these in. But in a weekly projection, you really want to drill down and think about the timing of these costs. You incur occupancy costs or rent all month long, but you only pay it in one particular week of the month. So you're looking at your disbursements and mapping those out over the timing of when you anticipate having to pay those. If you pay expenses through a credit card, you don't need to enter the charges on specific lines. You don't need to go worry about supplies, travel, and all the various captions. Instead, you want to enter your total credit card and bill on the line in the week in which you will pay it. So if you're looking at your credit card payments, you're going to put it in the week in which you would normally pay. So as you look at the projected cash on hand, to that last row of the cash flow projection, is taking your beginning balance plus your receipts minus your cash paid out to project your cash on hand at the end of the month. So this is where you're going to look at and see where are there weeks where I am anticipating a low or a negative balance. These are the weeks where you're going to have problems with your cash flow. So then you need to look at what can you do to accelerate the cash conversion cycle. There's lots of things that you can think about for ways to accelerate that cycle. Can you collect your receivables more quickly? If you implemented digital invoicing, would that get your bills out more quickly? What if you offered other payment options like ACH or credit cards? Would that speed up your collection? You can look at your invoicing and receivables cycle. Are there any redundant or unnecessary steps that slow down that cycle? How quickly do you get your invoices out after your goods or services are delivered? Can you put priority on speeding that up? Maybe you have designated reserves that the board could make available. Maybe you can go back to your donors who restricted their gifts and ask them to redirect them to general operations. Many of you have canceled events. Perhaps those people who purchased those tickets would be willing to convert it to a donation instead of having it refunded. On the disbursement side, can you delay any of your disbursements? Are you being intentional about the timing of when you pay your bills? Or are you just paying them, as they come in, regardless of whether they have a due date that would be farther out? Sometimes you can negotiate more favorable terms with your suppliers. If you do sell inventory, are you quickly pivoting with changes in customer demands? If you're not using a credit card for some of your disbursements, that's something to consider because it does delay your payment. I'm not saying that you want to incur a bunch of credit card debt, but if you're paying for those disbursements through your checking account anyway, using a card would allow you to just pay it in one chunk, quite a bit later of when you incurred the cost. You also might be able to get rewards from purchases that you're already making by using credit cards that provide cashback incentives. You might need to draw down on your line of credit. You might need to consider eligible spending from your endowments, refinancing existing loans, and then also whether there's any federal or state programs available to you under COVID-19. So you have to look at this scenario and see where you've got potential problems and use all those things that I just listed out to think about, where can I make changes? What would make the biggest impact? If your biggest issue is the timing of your collections of receivables, that's where you need to focus. How can I improve that process? How can I collect that more quickly? But maybe that's not your particular issue. So that's what this is all about, is creating your scenario and then looking for the issues and then finding opportunities to make changes that would make the biggest impact. So as each week goes by, you're going to update last week's estimates with the actual amounts from that week. So the more unstable your situation, the more often you should review and update your projections. But at least on a weekly basis, you're going to go back into your projection and say, okay, this week I had this for projections. Here's what actually happened. And that's going to recast the rest of your forecast. You can also copy over your projection. So the next slide shows a different scenario. So same thing as the first scenario, except contributions are at 80%. So if everything stays the same as I had estimated it, but my contributions are 80%. So maybe my first scenario was contributions will be about the same dollars and timing as they were, last year, or the last 16 weeks or whatever. This is an opportunity to say, well, what if it's not? What if they're only 80%? And you can see if my contributions go down to 80% of my scenario one, all of a sudden I have a cash flow problem in week 4, not week 6, and it stays with me for the whole 16 weeks. So using this tool to copy over and then plug in different what if scenarios gives you an opportunity to really evaluate what you could have in your situation and what changes you need to make. So you want to take time to evaluate your current cash resources, create your own weekly cash flow projection, and then analyze these areas where you need to focus on accelerating the cash conversion cycle. The next scenario we're going to talk about is analyzing program profitability. So now more than ever, it's important to evaluate the alignment of your mission with your programs and the profitability of them. So looking one by one at each of your programs with your leadership team or with your board, and evaluating and getting everybody to agree on how aligned each program is with your organization's mission. So over time, things can change, and you might have programs that are high alignment and others that are low alignment with your mission. So when it comes to assessing program profitability, we're looking at not just profitability, but also mission alignment. So first, evaluate the alignment to your mission of each program. Then you're going to calculate the contribution margin for each program. Each of your programs impacts your bottom line by contributing financially or causing a deficit. So it either has excess revenue over expenses, or it has excess expenses over revenue. Some programs are just inevitably going to have a deficit. That doesn't mean that it's a bad program. It just means that there has to be some other source of revenue to subsidize the deficit. So you have to either have some fundraising or other earned revenue to offset those deficits. So when you're doing this kind of analysis, if we can go to the next slide, there's an example. You're going to list out each of your programs, as well as your general and administrative and fundraising costs. Now, normally if you were doing program analysis or submitting for a grant application or reporting on grants, you would allocate some of your overhead, some of your capacity costs to the programs. In this program profitability model, you don't want to allocate your overhead to the program. For this purpose, you're going to have your program revenue and your direct program costs in the program columns, and your overhead or capacity costs in their own columns. So you want to think about, especially personnel, that's usually one of your biggest costs. You would normally probably allocate, say, an executive director a portion of their salary to the different programs. For this purpose, keep them in the capacity column, because if that program went away, it wouldn't change your overhead or your costs of your executive director. So look at the actual direct costs. So once you've done this, you're going to evaluate which programs provide additional cash resources to subsidize other programs, which programs have a deficit. You're going to take this information in conjunction with your assessment of mission alignment and evaluate your programs. So programs that have a high contribution margin, like in this example, program 2, you also want to think about how does it align with our mission. So if it's high contribution and high alignment, that's a clear winner, but those are often rare. You probably are competing with for-profit enterprises, but those are areas, high mission alignment, high profitability. Is there anything you can do to cultivate and preserve that program? Is there an opportunity to grow? If it's high contribution but low mission alignment, this is providing cash to subsidize other programs, but if it doesn't align with your mission, it could cause some threat of drift, which there could be some non-financial costs associated with doing things that are really outside of your mission. And then you've also got low contribution programs. Like in this example, program 1 is providing a deficit. That doesn't mean it's a bad program and that you need to discard it. If it highly aligns with your mission, but it's low contribution, you just have to find other ways to sustain that program. So there could be ways to charge additional fees, or there could be other programs that just are going to have to support that. But low contribution and low mission alignment is probably something that you could get rid of. These could be legacy programs that just have evolved over time and really no longer align with your mission. But these are the greatest opportunity for looking at discontinuing. So you really have to know how each of your programs aligns with your mission, and then know the margins that they produce, and then prioritize. So just having this clear picture of which programs provide a surplus, which programs require a subsidy. Once you understand that, then you can focus on making strategic changes that will help you achieve your mission, but still build a reserve for the future. At the end of the slides, there's a link to a great article that Nonprofit Finance Fund has on this. It's from several years ago, like 2010 or something, but the article has an example, and that's what I used to base this model on. They also show, the next slide shows what you could change in this scenario. So what this shows is that with just a couple of changes, they were able to reduce the deficit from program A by getting a corporate donor to help subsidize that program. And then program 2 was already profitable, but it was, I think it was 103 or something like that. They added additional fees. So they were already charging fees. The fees in the first scenario were $29. They go up to $149. So it's a profitable program. They realized they could actually increase the fees they charged and provide an even larger surplus to help not only subsidize program A, but to fund some of the capacity costs and have a budget surplus of 152 instead of a break-even budget that now allowed them to start building a reserve that prepares them to weather storms later on and gives them more flexibility in how they change. So you can see how important it is to take some time to assess the mission alignment, calculate program profitability, and then develop your priorities and strategies to determine what modifications you need to make. You can be really intentional about those changes. Lastly, I just want to share that scenario forecasting is hugely dependent on accurate, timely financial information. So if you don't have accurate, timely information, it can be really challenging to build meaningful scenarios. So once you have accurate, timely information, you want to organize it into reporting structures that you can use as tools for decision making, like these projections. The financials, your basic financials are important. They tell you what happened in the past. But if you want to influence your future results, you have to use scenario forecasts and key performance indicator monitoring. So some of the assumptions in your forecasting model may be temporary key performance indicators that you'll need to start measuring and monitoring in real time. You have to drill down to the underlying activities, but just as a quick example, if your cash flow projection assumes that you need to accelerate collection of accounts receivable, you can start tracking your days in AR, but that's really not going to help you change anything. If you start tracking the underlying activities, like how much time it takes you to get your bills out and the accuracy of your billings so that you don't have issues coming back with payment, those underlying activities will get you farther towards your goal of reducing your days in AR. So again, remember that Stockdale paradox. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. You've got to stabilize, protect your organization from the downside risk, make sure you have the liquidity that you need to weather the crisis, and then you have to adapt, find opportunities to make changes you probably wanted or needed to make anyway. If you have questions, I know we're probably past time to go on, so I'm glad to answer questions outside of this by email. My contact information is available, and I'd love to follow up one-on-one if there's something we can do to help you get started down this path, or just if you have some questions or need some clarity, I'm glad to answer questions when there's time available, or one-on-one if you want to follow up directly.
Courtney, thank you so much. You are so calming in such a challenging issue. And so I really appreciate the expertise that you shared with us today. And I will include those additional resources in our follow-up email to our participants today. So thanks for shouting out the Nonprofit Finance Fund. We found a lot of great information there that we'll share. I love that you really centered this around a quote. We were even talking in the past couple of weeks about how we've been finding inspiration through quotes. And so, Bridget, as we move into our discussion questions, if we could go there, Courtney, I appreciate your time, and we'll make sure that your information goes out. I have to say, Courtney's LinkedIn presence, if you are on LinkedIn, she does